Welcome to Redesigning the Dharma. I'm your host, Adrian Baker, and today I'm speaking with Scott Tusa. Scott is a Buddhist meditation teacher and practitioner who has spent the last 25 years exploring how to embody and live meaningfully through the Buddhist path. At age 16, his mother's death sparked a deep longing for healing and spiritual wisdom that eventually led him to Tibetan Buddhism. He spent his early 20s seeking out and learning from a variety of Tibetan Buddhist masters and was ordained by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama as a Buddhist monk at age 28. He spent the next 9 years as a monk deepening his understanding of the Dharma, engaging in solitary meditation retreats, and continuing his studies with teachers in India, Nepal, and the United States, including his main teachers Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Tsoknyi Rinpoche. Since 2008, he has been teaching Buddhist meditation in group and one-to-one settings in the United States, Europe, Latin America, and online, bringing Buddhist wisdom to modern meditators, helping them to deepen and develop more confidence in their practice. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and as always, please, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, things you'd like to see more of, please follow up and reach out either in the comments section on YouTube or Instagram, as well as just reaching out directly through email, sahajasoma@pm.me. Thank you very much for joining me for part 2 on Redesigning the Dharma. It's great to have you back.
It's great to be back. I always enjoy talking with you. So
you too. Okay, so letting the audience know, we were brainstorming a little bit before what we might want to talk about. And the original idea for the conversation, why I reached out to you, is that I really want to discuss Tsoknyi Rinpoche's Fully Being material, which you're very familiar with as someone who offers assistance on his retreats, and the value of those teachings, especially pairing that with a non-dual contemplative path like Dzogchen. But as kind of a setup for that conversation, I think what would be helpful maybe is to talk about some of the issues we were both seeing in the modern, you can say modern spiritual scene, but just among people interested in exploring a different contemplative side of themselves, even the wellness scene. And that's sort of what Trungpa Rinpoche famously called spiritual materialism, and how a lot of these pursuits can start out as a healthy exploration, but at a certain point, if people don't become aware of seeing the patterns, it's actually just another form of samsara. And I thought we might talk about that a little bit for the audience. So how would you say, first of all, like what spiritual materialism is, and then give some concrete examples of how you see it play out in today's spiritual or wellness scene?
Yeah, and just to say it's kind of a dynamic thing too. I would just start out the conversation by making it very wide, which is I believe it's something that affects all of us. And it's not like something you can avoid just by deciding I'm not going to be a spiritual materialist.
Yeah.
It's just as long as we have some form of ego clinging, or we cling to self in some sort of way, or emotions, ideas, thoughts, beliefs, which all of us do, myself included. As long as that's happening, I think when we approach a spiritual path, whether it's Buddhism or another path, we can just sort of assume some spiritual materialism will probably creep in there, right? So I like to start with that premise, because then it comes more from an angle of not rooting out this kind of evil thing, but trying to recognize where our path can get diverted through spiritual materialism.
I think that's well said. I can recognize that in my own journey as well.
Yeah, definitely for me. And I don't know if it's something I've rooted out. I think it's just something I'm acutely aware of now. And I try to work really honestly with my chosen path as a way not to bolster and build and reify myself in ego clinging and beliefs, but instead to open up the core of dukkha, or the core of what makes me suffer and causes dissatisfaction. And I think for me, at least on the Buddhist path, that's what helps to really break apart spiritual materialism. And that would be my definition too, just to answer your question. You know, it's a way of using a spiritual practice or any kind of religious practice to bolster one's ego clinging, which from a Buddhist perspective, you know, there's a little bit of backstory here. Buddhism points out that is the core of suffering. So it's not saying like you're a bad person for ego clinging, or I'm a horrible practitioner for ego clinging. It's saying, hey man, you're suffering because of it. Let's work on that. So it's not a judgment. It's an actual diagnosis is the word I like to use sometimes.
That's what I was just thinking when he said it. Dharma as medicine. Yeah. Okay, so great diagnosis or great framing of that. So can you give some examples of how you see that play out, whether you want to share something from your own experience or how you see it like in trends among students or in the larger culture?
Yeah, that's a great question also, because I see it as something that has layers to it. It's not like a singular behavior or way of working with a spiritual practice. It goes from what I would consider to be like grosser, more obvious ways of spiritual materialism playing out to more subtle. So like probably similar to you know, some of the more grosser ways I think I've been able to to work with and remedy. At least I have the illusion I have. I'm not sure if I actually have, but there's definitely subtler ones that are still present that I have to watch out for, right? And so we can start maybe with the grosser. The grosser, I think, would be the kind of obvious, some of my friends call it like the spiritual industrial complex, right? The way spirituality, whether that's authentic or sort of derived and cherry picked from traditional forms. Again, I don't believe there's anything wrong with making money. We all need to support ourselves, but it can become purely a way to sort of stay in that aggressive marketing world of, I don't know, trying to get rich as opposed to just trying to sustain oneself. I think they're two different things. And there's nothing wrong with being rich. It's just what's the platform we're coming from. And so often we can see that. That's quite obvious. And then there's lots of ego trips. There's lots of identities we take on that are very obvious, meaning, you know, we start wearing beads everywhere and we have no idea what it means. We're just like, oh, this is spiritual. So there's some like obvious tropes there. And that's not to insult anyone. I mean, I kind of also feel, just to point this out as a little sidebar, whatever helps people also to remember spiritual themes that are positive. So if someone wants to like adorn their entire body with mala beads because it reminds them of compassion, great. Like, you know, like I'm not going to fault them for that. I'm just glad they're doing something to remember compassion. So I also want to say that too, because otherwise it can become overly judgmental. But of course, what we're talking about is that particular person, in that case, dressing up as a spiritual person, that particular person, if they are doing it with a spiritual materialist kind of perspective or hidden implicit way of operating, it might not undermine their dissatisfaction and suffering. And that I am concerned with. So that's more the issue. We can obviously see some of those things in the world. And then you have spiritual materialism going all the way down to sort of, I don't know, belief, I would consider to be some type of spiritual materialism. But what's interesting is I'm also a fan of what I call temporary beliefs that we are curious about. And this is sort of my opinion now, my view. We all believe something, even if that thing is, I'm going to get up and eat tacos today. Like, it's still a belief. It didn't happen yet. It's still an expectation. And so, you know, Dzongtso Khyentse Rinpoche pointed this out. He said, we basically can't live without beliefs. It's almost impossible because we have to have some way to frame where we're going, what we're trying to do. So of course, things like Buddhism do that as well. We have temporary beliefs we take on, like karma, cause, and effect. That's a subtle relative truth within the world we have to be mindful of. The teachings on non-duality, which, you know, for me, when I first encountered Buddhism, were just totally gibberish, like not understandable, right? And I had to see, oh, there's something here that's interesting. And then I had to take on a temporary belief that there's some use to that. And then, of course, pursuing that with curiosity. So for me, it's not having beliefs that makes it materialist. It's fixating on those and reifying those and solidifying, and especially creating identities around those. Because the whole thing with, you know, at least the Indic traditions is recognizing when we hold too tightly to identities, we suffer. And then, of course, in more extreme circumstances, we create suffering for others based on those identities sometimes. So I'll just say that, because there's so many different types of spiritual materialism, but I'll just say it's anything that's reifying a strong sense of self. But again, there's many ways we cling to self or function from self. Some of it is based on ideas and thoughts and beliefs. Some of it is on emotions. Some of it is on our body, right? Like how our body is, good or bad, whatever. And then, of course, there's judgments about all that. And so whenever that gets reified or solidified, that we could call that materialism, actually, from a Buddhist perspective. And then when you have the word spiritual, that just applies to any religious spiritual beliefs or functions around that.
Just one thing that came up as you were talking about it, I really like what you shared, was Tsoknyi Rinpoche has talked about before, being on the lookout for hope and fear. Where there's hope and fear, there's clinging. And to me, that's a really like practical exercise that you can do to scan for that. And I notice that when there's hope or fear, and again, it's totally natural to have hope or fear. They're there for an evolutionary reason as emotions. But especially when something's like not an imminent threat, you're undertaking a new whatever it is, entering into a new business, a relationship, any number of things. When you start to have that hope and fear, that's going to invite projection. And the projection, again, it serves a purpose. But then when we believe the story, as opposed to like just maybe drop the story and we're going to get into fully being and be with the feeling underneath it, the feeling is often, that's the test. And when it's really tight and there's a contraction around things, when we're attached to the outcome, which is a good teaching from the Gita, right? Don't be attached to the outcome. Then we're going to suffer, right? Because we're not in contact with the groundless ground. We're not in contact with impermanence. And we're trying to control things, right?
Yeah.
Because we're afraid of the real nature of reality, which is impermanent. And then when we're holding tight like that, it just creates all this tension in the subtle body so that when energy wants to move through us, we can't because we're not open.
I use those tools as well. I mean, to me, hope and fear is like it's like one of the bigger mechanisms of samsara itself, like the samsaric mind. And I can find myself all day long pretty much just flipping between hope, fear, attachment, aversion, right? Just all day long, back and forth. Thankfully, I have a little bit of mindfulness, so I could watch my mind do that and hopefully have a little more choice in that. But yeah, another tool I like to use is curiosity, which is, curiosity takes a lot of different forms, but often for me, curiosity takes the form of an open question where there's no right answer. There's just looking and observing and getting to know something. That's generally how I treat my Buddhist study. Because as I already said, like Buddhism has a lot of beliefs, but Buddhism is explicit about that. It doesn't try to trick you and say, hey, we don't believe anything. But what it does describe is why the beliefs are there. And I think one of the most succinct ways to put it is the beliefs are there to go beyond belief. And that's a very unique way to work. And so what I found is it's almost impossible for me to do that work. I have not gone beyond belief. That would be an awakened person who's gone beyond belief. Right. But even to like put myself in the position to go in that direction, I need a lot of curiosity, a lot of openness, a lot of letting go, which we're going to talk about too, and letting be, which is more the somatic element of it. But yeah, spiritual materialism, just to reiterate, I just feel like it'll be with me till the very last moment I'm holding on to samsara in some form, probably a very subtle form at that point, but it'll be there. And that's okay. So it's kind of like, my take is like learning to live with it and becoming aware of it so we don't fall victim to it as much, right?
That's a perfect segue. So let's talk about how to not fall victim to it through the fully being teachings, which are helpful with any number of things, including this. So can you give people just the short executive summary of what the fully being teachings from Tsoknyi Rinpoche are? And then we'll start to go into different components of that and the relevance to this and other topics.
Yeah. Just for some background on me, in case the listeners don't know, I've been teaching Buddhist meditation for since 2008, so about 18 years. And I met Tsoknyi Rinpoche in 2010 and became one of his students, and then started teaching for his organization around 2012, give or take, something like that. And a large part of the work I do, as well as his translator, Adam Kane, is work through a course and program he developed called Fully Being. And so Fully Being, it's a set of practices. Some of it is what Tsoknyi Rinpoche likes to call his healthy human being practices, but also it does have some traditional Buddhism in there as well. But just assuming you kind of want to focus more on the healthy human being aspect first, so we can talk about that. And so the healthy human being aspect of the practices of Fully Being are made up essentially of 3 practices. There's more than that, but I'll just summarize it into 3. The first one's called dropping. The second is vase breathing, which is a traditional practice that he's sort of augmented for physical health and mental health. And then the third one's called handshaking. And essentially all 3 of them are body-based somatic practices, more or less based on things that Tsoknyi Rinpoche witnessed over the years of him teaching, because I think he's been teaching in the West more than 35 years, like a really long time, since he was in his 20s, and he's about to turn 60. So yeah, and what he noticed, I'm paraphrasing, but this is what he said, is that for many years he thought his Western students were doing really well with practice because they would be able to repeat back very eloquently and in deep ways the Dharma, even like very complex teachings on emptiness or Dzogchen. Their understanding was really good. They were practicing, but over time he wasn't seeing the kind of transformation or change that he would see in some of his students, let's say Nepal or Tibet or India. And it wasn't a comparison, it was just more like, what do I do? And this is one of kind of the unique qualities of Tsoknyi Rinpoche. I mean, many lamas who come to the West, but I think he really like got out of his own way in a sense and was like, what do these people actually need? And what he saw was this deep disconnection we have not only in the West, but just in the modern world, this disconnection between the thinking mind and body, or feeling, what he calls the feeling world. So feeling world and the thinking mind. And when he used to teach this early on, when I met him, he would describe this, really eloquently, this disconnect. Almost like, there's something talking above, but the down below in the feeling world is not listening. And until that connection starts to get made, the deeper qualities of the Buddhist path meditating on compassion, bodhicitta, emptiness, of course, shamatha. It's difficult to penetrate them because there's all this noise happening at the level of the feeling and all this constriction, right? And so he developed, in particular, handshake practice kind of out of a merger of Mahamudra and I guess you could say like somatic psychology that he was learning a lot from people like Tara Goldman, Danny Goldman, people like that. Yeah. So it was this merger of how to feel the feelings, but not reify them. So again, it has this incredibly dharmic component to it. We're not feeling them to bolster them and create some new ego of now I'm in touch with my feelings. It's more the energy of like, how do I have full openness and compassion with my feeling world? He teaches that we're not actually going in there to fix anything, which I think is the unique part. That's more the Mahamudra element. We're not going in there to fix it. We're allowing things to unwind by themselves. So there's more to say. The vase breathing relates more to speediness. We can talk about that too. But I just decided to start with handshake for them.
Thank you for that. I want to lay the foundation, but I can't help but ask a little bit of a Dharma geek question here, the way you laid it out. Because you talked about how it was a union of the somatic psychology with Mahamudra, and that jumps out because Tsoknyi Rinpoche normally is known for teaching more Dzogchen, from what I can tell. Minya Rinpoche teaches more Mahamudra. And so I'm curious, is there something specifically about Mahamudra as opposed to Dzogchen that can be seen in kind of the operating system of fully being? Because I'd be curious to understand that.
Yeah, it could be seen within the practices of dropping and handshaking, which, essentially become one thing because dropping becomes the first part of handshake practice. And Rinpoche does teach both. I mean, he's trained in the Drukpa Kagyu and many Nyingma lineages. Right. You're correct, though. He tends to kind of, in the front, teach Dzogchen a little bit more. But there is actually Mahamudra in his teachings as well. Maybe not as explicit. But he himself, I believe, has practiced and studied a lot of Mahamudra. But either way, how it enters the handshake practice is kind of in a couple ways. Maybe I should point something out, the difference between one of the, I guess we'd say, practical differences between Mahamudra and Dzogchen. We often say this. Mahamudra is finding the view of Buddhist non-duality through meditation. So one learns to let be so deeply until that view is encountered. Whereas Dzogchen is the other way around. First, the view needs to be encountered or introduced, and then one meditates on that view. Technically non-meditates, but either way. So it's kind of a different process, same result. And what I've noticed is a lot of great masters, even nowadays, they kind of practice both. A lot of them do some form of both. And, there is say something a little bit controversial. It's not from me, but there is a wonderful teaching from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche where he basically says, even if you are practicing Dzogchen, you're technically most likely practicing Mahamudra until you get to a certain stage, right? Because this is the difference between what we call a gradual practitioner and more of an immediate practitioner. And, it's questionable whether any of the immediate ones even exist in the world. So most of us are gradual, even if we are practicing a non-gradual approach. Does that make sense?
It does. But yeah.
And of course, we can differentiate by technique and things like that. So the techniques can be a little bit different. But either way, I don't want to get too much in the weeds. So how it relates to handshake is, Mahamudra can be many things. So I don't want to oversimplify it into one thing. But some of the practices in Mahamudra rely heavily on more or less letting be with awareness, letting be with mind, turning towards mind and letting be with it. Not all of the practices. There's also different kinds of techniques of insight and producing glimpses of the view, etc. But in general, it's sort of very much in line with what you started to say. It's really working with hope and fear through the process of not accepting and not rejecting. And so, of course, we don't just sit down to meditate and do that, but we attempt to do that. So this can, initially can relate to thinking or contents of thought, sense perception, all of it. But the way Tsoknyi Rinpoche delineates the difference between handshake and, let's say, Mahamudra and Dzogchen is handshake is particularly doing that, not accepting, not rejecting within a somatic feeling-based approach, where it's mostly working with the feeling world of emotions, sensations, and what he calls subtle body energies.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. I wanted to pick up on that point right there on subtle body, because you laid out the three practices very well for the foundation of fully being. And I also know in terms of I'm thinking the online platform, what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
Essence, love, and subtle body are also two very important pieces of it. And so
yes, Yeah.
I wanted to hear you talk about those two briefly to lay that out. And maybe we could start with subtle body and what that is, because I'd like to connect it actually to what we were talking about at the start of the podcast, because I think a lot of the issue we have in this society, the way that people can't connect to the feelings and in some ways progress along the path as quickly, is because there's so much speediness in the pace of this society, and there's speediness in the subtle body, the way that Rinpoche talks about. So I'm wondering if you could start by talking about what the subtle body is briefly, and then what's this issue of speediness in the subtle body we find in modern society, and how that creates issues for a lot of contemporary practitioners.
Sure. Trungpa Rinpoche comes back to mind, right? And what I was going to say was, I think it's difficult to have a conversation about how the West meets Vajrayana Buddhism without evoking Trungpa Rinpoche, because he very much was focusing and working on that. Despite what some people, have disagreements with his reputation and all that. If you read his teachings, they're incredible. They were specifically built for us, essentially. So I really appreciate that. And it's very apt what we're talking about, because we actually talked about two of the main things he defined the West by. He defined, well, let's say the US by speed, materialism, and then the third is aggression. And he wasn't saying, there's positive things, I'm sure he thought as well. He was just saying these are the three main issues that are obstacles to Dharma practice for you guys.
Yeah.
Right. And again, it's not like, before I go into your question, it's not like materialism only affects Westerners or people from the US. It's just that we have a particular materialist view that, some lamas have talked about it going back to Descartes and sort of the split of nature. And, there's elements of, we can see in Western culture where it did possibly happen and get split off, where the thinking mind becomes primary and everything body-based, nature-based is sort of like becomes part of the witch hunt, essentially. And again, I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to get out of my lane, but we can see the result of that, where it's almost like an embodiment of a difficulty relating to things that are not material and empirical. Of course, we have scientific materialism as a view that even reinforces that more. So we can get to that later. I just wanted to point that out. But the speediness is just that. It's the constant movement to be, to do, to engage. We were kind of talking earlier about this too, like the success wheel of like how we view success. It requires speed.
To achieve and attain. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I sort of usually put on the umbrella of like to be. But that being becomes much more reified and much more important. To give an example, and again, I don't want to generalize for everyone, but the way I grew up, sort of like, again, this is implicit, it's not explicit. It's like more important who I become than who I am with people. Like I wasn't taught necessarily that. Sort of implicitly, I was taught that through compassionate people, and family was still important when I grew up. Now, I don't know. I live in Mexico where everything's family, but in the US, it's changed a lot, right? So anyways, I think speed is just a byproduct of the way we push and force and try to squeeze and wring everything out of the material that we can. Of course, that relates to money, reputation, all of that. I like to frame this also, it's not our fault. It's not like, I'm not trying to criticize anyone for that. It's not like it's my fault for that or yours or anyone else's. It's the water we're swimming in. And so just to do and build.
The ocean of samsara.
Yeah, the ocean of samsara, and as I said earlier, it just manifests different ways in different cultures. Yeah. It's not like the West is bad and the East is great. It's just different issues. So particularly when we're talking about speed, when it relates to the subtle body, we're talking about the inner speediness, which is, of course, I'll talk about energy in a second, relates to like the energy movement of our body, but it also relates to how we think and the speed of how we think and pushing that. And, just in my case, I am pretty much like a chronically anxious person since I don't even remember when that started. My dad said, you were always anxious. So must have been from like a really young age. And when I became a meditator, it got worse because then I was trying to be the meditator, especially going into, solitary retreat as a monk and just pushing myself, not knowing, of course, there was speediness as an ideal and as a motivation for getting something. But there's also the energetic speediness. And what I ended up crashing into is a severe wind disorder or a lung disorder that I had to remedy through meditation, Tibetan medicine, and just chilling the F out, basically, right? Yeah. And Tsoknyi Rinpoche was one of the main people who brought that to my attention and helped me a lot.
To chill out.
Just to like, hey, here's something to work on that. And primarily he gave me the vase breathing, which I'll talk about now, related to the subtle body. So speediness can be many things. We have physical speediness, we have mental speediness, and then we have energetic speediness, or the lack of, right? So, I was describing mental speediness, and that relates to the doing, becoming, pushing, getting more, right? And it's that attitude and framing of like the thinking mind moving all day long towards that, or I guess we could say sort of fixing, problem solving, etc. Right? There's nothing wrong with ambition. It's just how much ambition. And there's nothing wrong with using the thinking mind. We need the thinking mind. It's just how much do we need it?
Also, when I'm hearing you talk about achievement, some people might be like, what's wrong with achieving something? I think it goes back to what we said about identity. It's not the issue of having goals and doing good and accomplishing things. That's not the issue. It's constructing the identity around that. Not saying that's like a moral, good or bad thing. It's just inviting people to look within one's own experience and how that creates the conditions for suffering, because of the instability that comes from that. So you're obsessed with being rich and powerful or famous or good looking. But the problem with that is you have to measure that. You need comparison. And then the moment you're comparing, there's always someone, there's always less than, over than, and you're not connecting with people because it's all hierarchical. It's domination.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great way to put it. And, I usually say too, it's sort of like a lot of this to achieve or not to achieve. As you said, we don't have to create a duality around that. Mm-hmm. It's more what, I usually put it as what's the platform or motivation we're doing that from. So platform just meaning motivation, identities, etc. And so maybe to punt something to later if we want to talk about it, one of the fundamental areas of how we stagnate as a human being and suffer more in a self-imposed way, we self-inflict, is through something called self-centered cherishing. So when our platform, when we're achieving from that modality primarily, it will create not only stagnation in that, but more agitation, more pain, more dissatisfaction, etc. For most of us. I don't know if I can say this as a blanket statement. So anyways, so that self-cherishing is like another element of this, but it's a little bit deeper than the fully being element. So to get back to that, so we have speediness of thinking mind. We have speediness of the physical, which has a limit. There's only so much how fast we can be with the physical body. And the energy body also has a speed limit. The energy body also can get overwhelmed. The thinking mind's kind of interesting because Tsoknyi Rinpoche says actually the thinking mind doesn't have as much limits. But the problem is, for most of us, our thinking mind is deeply connected to the energy body, to the subtle body. Mm-hmm. And so when we do push the subtle body beyond its speed limit, that's when a lot of our emotional and psychological problems start happening. Right?
Yes.
Including anxiety, depression, etc. Right? So
I noticed that myself, prone to agitation, impatience, things like that. If I'm too on the move, things like that, there's too much energy buildup. There's too much energy relative to the space that's holding it. And then it can burst out as impatience or agitation.
Yeah, totally. I think each of us has our own vices and kind of directions. Mine tends to go more anxious, but it can also go more agitation sometimes too. But so now maybe I'll describe the subtle body. You tell me, Adrian, how much you want to go in the weeds with this, because it definitely is like a little bit more inner science of Buddhism and traditional medicines. So the subtle body in the Tibetan system, we usually describe as 3 components that are interwoven. And these 3 components in Tibetan are called tsa, lung, and tigle. And so tsa, we usually translate as like the systems of channels throughout the body, energetic channels. These aren't physical, right? They're energetic. They're not perceptible with a machine yet, or the eyes. The lung is the wind energy, which I started to describe earlier. When we're talking about speed level, we're talking about lung, wind energy. Because lung is basically the energy of movement in the subtle body. And then tigle is a little more difficult to translate and describe, but tigle basically refers to what are called like our essential drops. It's an oversimplification, but basically it's mind on the level of energy. And so the traditional analogy for this is that the lung, the wind energy, is like the horse. This is a tradition Tibetan. So we could also say a car, right? But basically the vehicle that gets us somewhere. So the lung is like the horse. It's what takes you there. The mind, or we could actually say the tigle, I believe, the essential drops, are like the rider. And then where does the rider and the horse move through? On the roadways of the channels, right? So that's essentially how the subtle body works. Now, the subtle body is a huge science. So we're not talking about woo-woo kind of new age bookstore here. This is like a probably more than 10,000-year-old science developed through medical traditions like Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, Tibetan medicine. And then yogis and yoginis took advantage of this knowledge to figure out how to manipulate the subtle body to attain enlightenment. So we also have practices for actually manipulating the subtle body to awaken. But in fully being, we're more talking about the health. We're not talking about the path of awakening through the subtle body. Just understanding the subtle body as a mechanism that sits between the physical body and the mind. And so a lot of the time what we're treating is the mind when it comes to psychological disorders. What traditional medicine tends to treat is the subtle body. And therefore practices like vase breathing also help, because we're breathing deep into the lower abdomen and bringing that excess upward moving wind energy down, because that's usually what's affecting the speediness of the modern person.
One question I imagine someone's asking who's perhaps well-versed in a lot of modern contemplative practice, wellness, spiritual stuff is, well, okay, isn't that like very analogous to the nervous system? And how's it different from, like, if I already know about the nervous system, do I need to know about the subtle body? And my kind of intuition, I'd be curious to hear yours, is there's overlap there, but it's not totally synonymous. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, the truth is, I don't know 100%. Like, we don't know, right? 'Cause we're talking like different systems of medicine and science. But yeah, I mean, it seems like they are cousins, right? Because generally, when there's a disruption in the channel, or the channel gets bended or knotted, we're not talking about a physical thing. We're talking about something energetic. Maybe a better word is like a resonance. And when that resonance gets a constriction, a knot, a roadblock, whatever we want to call it, most of us do not feel that in the energy channel. We feel it in the nervous system. That's the bell ringing. Hey, pay attention, right? And so they're definitely closely related. Tsoknyi Rinpoche used to have a wonderful example. He doesn't use it so much anymore, of like, he would take like a gong, like a small bell, and sort of cover it with his hand so it doesn't ring. It just sort of clicks when you beat it with a stick. Those things you'd use for meditation or whatever. So he basically is pointing out the stick is like the lung, right? Stuck and circling in the channel and creating stagnation. Where is it hitting? In the bowl, which is the metaphor for the channel. But the sound, what's that? That's the resonance we can actually feel and hear in the nervous system. And of course, playing out in our behaviors, psychology. He often describes speediness in the body as like a sense of just, we're never settled. It's like the feeling of drinking 3 coffees, but maybe like, we can all feel that. We drink too much coffee, we can't like sit down. But a lot of us feel that way without drinking coffee, or we feel a subtler version of that. And that's when the speediness is too high. So I don't know if that kind of connects to the nervous system stuff, but we feel it there, I think.
Yes. Thank you for that.
So, and one more distinction. Sorry,
please,
real quick. The nervous system is physical. Like, we can open up a body and find it. The subtle body, you can't.
Right. And so I think that's a helpful thing to say for people that, again, it goes back to the scientific materialist worldview. It's thinking about the difference between like the brain and consciousness, or neuroscience and consciousness. We're talking about how to navigate experience or consciousness skillfully. And consciousness is a fundamentally subjective experience. It's different than the brain, which is an object. It's a location in time and space. And so that's a very different thing. But so that's why these maps that are not the territory, they're not necessarily physically or literally true, can still be helpful on a certain level. If they're a skillful means for navigating experience or describing what's happening, then that's the distinction. So it's not viewing it through like the lens of science, objective reality. This is subjective reality.
Exactly. And that's one huge difference. Is, I think, in the West, we have difficulty building a system on subjective. Actually, the irony is we build lots of things based on subjective analysis. We just won't admit it.
Sure. Assuming that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain is actually just an assumption. It's not a proven.
Exactly. I had one more thought on this.
Sure.
Oh, it was on literalism. I think this is one of the things that's really interesting when we study subtle body across Eastern traditions. Because the traditional Chinese medicine maps it slightly different than traditional Tibetan medicine and Ayurvedic medicine. And they all work, right? So that's kind of to your point. It's like the way we understand something and codify it and talk about it and even like draw it on paper, that can be one thing. But what we're trying to do is have an outcome via treatment. As long as the outcome is what we're looking for via treatment or a practice or whatever, you can map it all kinds of different ways. Because that map is just merely conceptual to understand something that's non-conceptual, essentially.
Yeah, thank you for that. I also wanted to make a point that feels relevant to it about just being with the feeling in the contractions that can come with it, because I found Rinpoche's teachings to be very helpful on a number of levels in fully being, including with understanding how ayahuasca, or the ayahuasca analog I work with more, Soma, work. So one thing Rinpoche says is, from my recollection, you can correct me, is that we have this feeling for karmic knot, emotional blockage. It gets triggered in the subtle body. And then we go from the feeling world into the mind. And so we think a lot of times that we need to be with the story, but actually We just need to drop the story and to be with the feeling. And it's by offering this loving, open attention to the feeling. It's like a child that just wants to be listened to. That's how the energy opens up and moves. And I noticed that within my experience by practicing it. And I also noticed that's how ayahuasca and soma work. And a lot of times what's missing in the West is people aren't understanding it through Rinpoche's subtle body framework. They talk about ayahuasca in a psychotherapeutic way. It's about stories and things that come up. And in my experience, the sentient intelligence of the medicine can work that way, where it's like showing aspects of my behavior, a pattern, shadow stuff, and it is inviting me to see something. But a lot of times it is really just dialing into these karmic knots in the body and releasing them. And they come up in the visionary experience a lot. They might be a karmic vision or karmic trace. Norm Kai Norbu actually talks a lot about this in his Dream Yoga book, which is super applicable to the medicine I found. But we actually don't need to like integrate a lot of this stuff in the sense of like, I need to take this content, I need to make it into a story and keep going into the cognitive mind more. It's actually just relaxing and opening more and more, and being in the body and being with the feelings and being with that tender open-heartedness. And the more we're there, that's what liberates the knots and allows energy to move more freely. It's not going into the story.
Yeah, I like how you put that. In a similar way, I think it's really the letting go of the control that does a lot of the work. Right?
Yes.
And that's essentially what letting be is. Letting be is, just for the audience, it's a large part of the handshake practice. When we're dropping into the feeling world, we're attempting to drop, rejecting the feeling, becoming it or encouraging it, running away from it or trying to fix it. And what happens when those four things drop as ways of being is we let be with what's arising. But we can get on to essence love at some point if you want. But in my experience, that doesn't mean the feeling goes away. And that's the interesting part that I think is the bigger dive in the practice. But I will say certain things can resolve, or unwind. Just like you were saying in your experience of plant medicine, certain things can kind of unknot or unwind. So with handshaking, certain things can unknot and unwind over time through letting be with it in a compassionate way, without judgment, feeling the feeling, not thinking about the feeling, etc. But what I found, and I just want to mention it before I forget, is if you want to pick up on it later on the thread to traditional non-dual practices, this is the point I think is really interesting, where yes, things can resolve and shift, but also we just learn to be with suffering in a different way, where we don't have to control it anymore. That, I think, is more interesting.
Yeah.
And it's much more pointing at the freedom they're talking about, I believe, in these non-dual traditions, right? We cease to control reality anymore, and therefore what isn't reality can dissolve and resolve on its own. What is will stay, essentially. That's something Tsoknyi Rinpoche believes, which I've come to see as, wow, just so profound, but also just such a compassionate way of working with oneself,
I really like that. Thank you for that. And I think that's a great way to reframe it for people, because there's this subtle story, like we're getting to liberation, and there's this idea of really the ego wants to get beyond suffering. And it's actually more about learning to make space for things and the equanimity part. I think one of my favorite stories of this is the Dalai Lama tells the story of some practitioner asked him for some practice, apparently. And he said, oh, that practice isn't appropriate for you. It's really for a younger practitioner. And then later, this person went off and killed themselves because they wanted to get reincarnated as a younger practitioner to receive the practice. This is like totally wild. Yeah. And
hell of a commitment.
Seriously.
Yeah.
And the person asked the Dalai Lama, like, how did you kind of get over that? And he really paused for a long time and was with it. And he thought about it. And he's like, not totally over it, like still there a little bit.
Yeah.
And he talked about there's space, and there's tenderness. And I thought that was just a really important thing. Like when we heal from something, sometimes there's a scar. It's just going to be there. And it's learning to live with that. And that's part of the letting be, instead of like the way it can show up is the idea of closure. Not that there isn't something to having closure, don't get me wrong. But if it's coming from an energy of like, I want to get rid of it, I don't want to feel that, there's a real shadow to that. And it's still the controlling aversion kind of attachment, push-pull energy.
Exactly. And to just sort of go back to recapitulate the spiritual materialism stuff, that would be a subtler version of spiritual materialism, right? Where we're looking for conclusion in the sense of this particular thing is bad, go away, and this other thing I want, which is actually one of the biggest dualities we could have. From a Buddhist perspective, making awakening this thing over here and samsara this thing over here.
Yeah.
Eventually, the Vajrayana teachings reconcile that, right? But yeah, that's what I meant by spiritual materialism. It can be really gross and very subtle. Like that's a very subtle form of it. But I love what you said. And, Tsoknyi Rinpoche says it this way, where he says, I am totally fine with 80% healed. Like, he names some of his particular traumas, things that happened from his youth, like fear of heights, things like that. And his work with handshake practice on a personal level, he says pretty much has healed those like 70 to 80%. And this is what hit me. And I'm paraphrasing him. This is more my way of thinking it for me. But he says like that 20% I actually want. And this is the other side of it, which is kind of similar to what you were saying, just like letting go of perfection, even within this realm. But the other thing that he points out, which is just so alive and raw for me when I think about it, is that 20% of the wound being there, but not interrupting our life because it's healed 80%. But that 20% is the compassion we can have and remember the experience for compassion for others. So it's almost like, it's so powerful when you think of that, because it's almost like when that really clicks, you don't want complete healing because then you're out of touch with people, right?
Yeah.
So it's very beautiful when we're talking about, especially for those of us who are into our spiritual path, being of service to others, but not in a fake way, not in a giant virtue signal, in a real way where we've transformed ourselves and it naturally happened. We didn't take on a role or put on robes or I'm going to go save the world. I don't know if that's even useful at this point. But saving that 20% and just being honest, we can function from that place and help others.
I like that a lot. Yeah. Can you say something now about what essence love is and how it's really connected in a lot of ways to what we've been talking about? What happens when we're opening more to these contractions and how we can, once those start to be liberated, what's revealed underneath.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good point to also make a distinction between the path of liberation and the path of healing, right? Because these can also get sort of mixed up. And this is really from Tsoknyi Rinpoche's language, and just maybe it's a good time to point out, go hear it from the source. I would highly recommend, go to fullybeing.org, go to tsoknyirinpoche.org. He's an amazing teacher in person.
We'll include that in the show notes.
Yeah, just kind of promoting that. I don't get anything out of that promotion, by the way, other than just like sharing my teacher's wonderful work. Okay, so on one side, essence love is kind of, he defines it in many ways, but it's a term he made up, but he's referring to an experience of our basic okayness as a human being. It's definitely in the realm of healthy human beingness. We're not even talking about post-human being, liberation, awakening, all that kind of stuff yet. We're just talking about like a functional, okay, sort of happy human being, right? Whatever that means. Not perfection. We're in samsara, but, and how he usually frames this is, I think there's many ways, but one way that hits me is sort of like you have different kinds of distortions on top of things. And so, of course, samsara itself is a distortion on top of our genuine nature. That's the more path of liberation side of it. But putting that aside for a moment, as human beings, we can also have distortions on top of what it means to perceive ourselves and others from a place of a healthy human being. And what a healthy human being has a deep connection with is essence love, which is just a sense of okayness, happy for no reason. It's not expressed love. It's not like being in love or expressing love to oneself or others. It's just knowing oneself is basically okay. My language around this, I just usually teach this as like, we are not fundamentally a screwed up person. And essence love is the feeling of that. It's a knowing that's not understanding through thinking, it's understanding through the body. And that, of course, there's many ways to that, but handshake practice reveals that over time by not manipulating our feelings and essentially being with them with compassion, real compassion, which means being with discomfort, essentially, letting be with that. And as we train, essence love can start to come out because it's part of our basic humanness. It's just been covered over or distorted by elements of, modern culture and habit and maybe some not so great nurture.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And then how do the practices of fully being help to uncover that in a way that is distinctive from even really great meditation, like wonderful, laid out, step-by-step, shamatha to vipassana, structured practice, isn't necessarily getting to some of the things that Rinpoche is inviting us to see with fully being. And so can we talk about what this fully being brings to other forms of meditation that help us to kind of liberate those knots and connect with that essence love?
Yeah. So the healthy human being practices of dropping, vase breathing, and handshaking essentially remedy speediness and also remedy this disconnect with our essence love. And what's the opposite of that? It's kind of hollowness that a lot of us experience, including myself for many, many years. right? And so it starts to remedy that, not through thinking about it and resolving our stories, kind of similar to what you said, or necessarily the story of our trauma. And I'm not saying that's a bad way, it's just a different way. This is resolving it by being with the feeling in the body in an open, non-judgmental, compassionate way. And of course, that's a journey. It's like learning a new language, is what I found. And so someone can strictly do that path of healing and become a more open person, I believe more compassionate with themselves and others, maybe less burdened by their suffering, not without suffering. Suffering will still be there, just maybe not in the same way. And I think that's a wonderful gift to oneself and the world to do that. Now, for practitioners who want to go on to the path of liberation, as I said, he kind of developed some of these things, at the beginning for them. But now he's realized it's really, of course, it's for everyone, but people can do it at the level they want to do it at. But as you're kind of asking, for practitioners who are interested in the path of liberation and awakening, he calls it the ngöndro before the ngöndro. So ngöndro is a Tibetan word referring to that which comes before, or typically we'll just call it the preliminary practices. These refer to the 4 thoughts that turn the mind, and these 4 times 100,000 practices. We accumulate 100,000 each in the Vajrayana traditions. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail. People can go look at that elsewhere. And so he calls it the ngöndro before the ngöndro, because often we can do the traditional ngöndro as Vajrayana practitioners, but still have these obstacles and the stagnation in the subtle body. And so his wish is that practitioners will take it up, or fledgling practitioners, like people who want to be a practitioner, will take it up as an entranceway. And then in his view, there's a better chance the traditional Buddhist path will go in the right direction, especially the practices on bodhicitta, etc. Now, I know implicit in your question is also like, how does this relate to non-duality and sort of more the advanced practices, Mahamudra-style, etc. It's so helpful. For those of us who are interested in Mahamudra-style and more non-dual meditation practices, I call handshaking the Trojan horse, right? Because it's like, it looks like this wellness practice on initial glance, and it may look sort of similar to other somatic practices, but because it has this flavor of Mahamudra, and if one takes it up as a way of living, as opposed to just a technique one does on the cushion, right? So I'm much more interested in helping people to take it into a way of living, if they want to, way of being. Once that's happening, you are living with less control. You are living with more openness in the body and mind. You are living with, in my experience, more curiosity. I think curiosity is like absolutely a necessity for long-term handshaking practice. Because otherwise we're trying to figure out what's going on. We're trying to understand it. To really connect with essence love, I believe we have to drop the need to understand what's going on. And instead we meet it and stay with it. And over time, the feeling tells us its story. We don't tell it its story. That's the difference here. It'll say it, and a lot of wisdom comes from the feeling world. And what's interesting is I've noticed it's like simultaneous healing insight. The insight and knowledge from the feeling world happens as the things unwind. It's like the stories get unlocked, but they get unlocked through, for some people, images. For some people, just openness in the body. For some people, things they remember about the past. All kinds of things. But I think that's less important. It's important. But the most important is learning to be from a place of compassion and awareness, where we don't have to get rid of the suck all the time. We know how to meet the suck, is usually what I say. So that is the Trojan horse, I believe, for people who want to move into more emptiness meditation. Basically in Tibetan Buddhism, we have 3 traditions of meditating on non-duality: Mahamudra or Madhyamaka, Mahamudra, and Dzogchen. And these are not techniques. These are universes. That's something I just want to get out there more and more, because as these things get proliferated more, which I'm happy with, they can also get watered down into techniques, which is also part of the spiritual materialism trip, where these are whole universes. And of course, they have techniques within them, but they're not just a technique. But either way, letting be is already part of Mahamudra. Letting be with one's mind, letting be with one's experience, feeling world, etc. That's already included. So of course, at some point in that openness, it's going to give us the tools to either connect with that kind of openness on a deeper level through those traditions, or if we've already received pointing out and different kinds of instructions in those lineages, it's going to give us a way to connect with them in a deeper way.
Yeah. And to that last point, I found that it's really helpful, even when you've been on a path for a while, Dzogchen path. And the thing I noticed it was helpful with was, it takes a lot of discernment to be like, when is dropping to the nature of mind skillful, and when is it a bypass versus when I feel a contraction come up. And sometimes when I feel that contraction, it's not to try to just necessarily rest in Rigpa. The teachings talk about that. That's an ideal, and then everything is self-liberating. But if the contraction feels tight enough, I feel it's actually just handshaking it, fully being with that. And then through that, it can unravel and empty out into Rigpa, maybe. Or maybe you just kind of maybe the resonance is so strong, you've just got to be with that vibration for a while.
Yeah, totally. That's how I use it. And, once we kind of have a sense of what we're moving towards a little bit more, we don't have to use these techniques in such rigid ways, I believe. But that's after we understand them. And actually, I think distinction is important first, and then we can open it up. And yeah, I do something very similar where sometimes it's handshaking opens up into shamatha without support, sometimes into sort of more practice of the view or attempting that, as you said. And yeah, Tsoknyi Rinpoche says the same thing. To speak to something you were saying earlier, it's sort of like, at least in the Buddhist traditions of non-duality, non-duality is not an object we find. That would be duality, essentially. So that's the trickiest part, is like, okay, we're not finding anything, so what do we do? And that's what, for most of us, takes the most work. And I think, again, that Trojan horse of handshaking is sort of like, already we're learning to let be and just let things play out with the body. But, as you said, too, in another way, we're not gripping as much. We're not controlling as much. And that is a well-worn traditional technique in paths of liberation to sort of possibly allow the view to pop out. But again, we have to use language here. The view doesn't pop out. It's just the other shit drops away is more the way I think of it, right?
Nice way to put it.
Yeah, because the language in the tradition also talks about it as an object, but there's many, many wonderful teachings on that from incredible masters who say it's okay to actually talk about it as an object, but when we practice it, we don't practice it like that.
It's okay to talk about, you're seeing the view as an object.
Yeah, you have to, just because of the duality of language,
Yes.
I guess you don't have to. It's just that because Buddhist philosophy goes so deep into parsing it out through language, some elements of teachings on emptiness, most of the Prajnaparamita teachings, they need to be very specific. So that already they're being explicit. We're talking about something as an object that's not an object. But sometimes as beginners, we don't recognize that. So that can take some time.
Well, Scott, I'm conscious of your time, because I know you've got a call now, but I could talk to you another hour. We should do it again, but this was so much fun. Thank you so much.
Man.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, man. This is great. I really enjoyed talking to you, and great questions. And yeah, I'm down for a part 3 anytime.
Let's do it. To be continued. Oh, actually, one final thing, before we sign out, and I'll include it below, but I just want to give you the chance to tell people where they can find you about any upcoming offerings you have.
Yeah. If you want to know my offerings, I do offer through Fully Being. I'm one of the facilitators and guides there, so you can check me out there too, but mostly through my website, scotttusa.com. I offer mentoring for practitioners, both group and one-to-one. I have courses. I will have an upcoming live course starting in September called the Dharma Reboot.
Great. Okay. We can include those in the show notes. Thank you so much, Scott. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, brother. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it or found it helpful, please consider subscribing to Sahaja Soma on YouTube, rating the Redesigning the Dharma podcast on Apple or Spotify, or sharing this episode with someone who might benefit from it. Any and every little bit helps. Also, please bear in mind that the plants and compounds mentioned on this podcast and on the Sahaja Soma platform are illegal in many countries, and even possession can carry severe criminal penalties. None of this represents medical advice or advocacy and should be construed as a recommendation to use psychedelics. There are serious legal, psychological, and physical risks. Psychedelics are not for everyone. They can exacerbate certain emotional problems, and there have been, in very rare cases, fatalities. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you on the next episode or elsewhere on the Sahaja Soma platform.